All right, David. Thanks so much for jumping on the Skype call with me. It's going to be so great for like some of the viewers here to sort of see, what it is from a composer angle and stuff like that, and sort of how, how the world in licensing and composing worked for you. And so first off, I just wanted to ask you, how did you get your start? So going way back, like when you were a kid, how did you get into music? Before all this other stuff happened? I mean, was it the kind of thing where you had a very great affinity to music? Did you fall into it later? Was your family musical, or how did that work?
Okay, well, so that is going back a ways. My grandfather and my father were both amateur musicians. They both played the piano and sang and played both classical music and what they called popular music.
Yeah.
So I grew up hearing my father's repertoire. He played some Chopin, he played some Bach, he played some Beethoven, and he also played a ton of Tin Pan Alley stuff. So I heard all of that from a pretty young age. And then I learned the violin in school. They had a school program. It was one of the first instruments you could start. So that's what I started with. I never really liked it that much, and I wasn't that good at it. And then I actually got into really being interested in playing music. I went to a hippie summer camp when I was 11, and I learned to play a little bit of clawhammer banjo.
Yeah.
Then I came home after 4 weeks of that, and my sister had just gotten into the Beatles, and so that freaked me out. She played me a couple of records, and I was like, "Oh, that."
You're not that old.
She had a best friend who had older siblings who were hippies. So that's how we got to the Beatles.
Got it.
I'm not that young either. So my parents were like, well, do you want to, I came home saying, well, I want to learn the banjo. And my parents were like, maybe the guitar would be a little more like, universal, So between hearing the records and the fact that they could borrow a guitar from a neighbor, I was like, yeah, sure, the guitar's fine, whatever. And then I think later in high school, I found out about Duke Ellington and Charles Mingus, and so then I was interested in jazz composition more than classical music, and so I tried to study jazz in college. And
cool.
As the Dave Van Ronk saying goes, I wanted to play jazz in the worst way, and I succeeded. So that's kind of how I got into playing.
Nice. And then did that naturally evolve into getting a band together, or starting to play live, or?
I was too dumb to think about being a rock star or having a career like that. The first professional experience I had was, I guess, I gave a few lessons, and through a variety of odd circumstances involving being in New York and being a temp and things like that, I gave a couple lessons to Freddie Johnston when he was just getting started in New York. And after a couple lessons, the singer-songwriter, and after a couple lessons, he was like, it would be more efficient for me to hire you to play guitar in my band than to try to learn how to do what you're doing.
Right.
So I started playing with, that was the first sort of like project I was involved in that went anywhere. And with my unerring nose for commercialism, I quit after a year because I became interested in playing bluegrass dobro. So I played on Freddie's first record, which was a couple records before the big one that he made with Bad Reputation and all that. But that was my first experience being a sideman and being around like pop and singer-songwriter stuff.
Then the segue into making music for media or TV and film. How did that happen, and how did you sort of go from that point to there?
Yeah, well, ironically, again, like I left New York. I lived in New York City for 14 years, where there's tons of that, and the closest I got to it was I did sessions once in a while for people who were composing for that kind of thing. But I moved to Austin before I really began working as a composer, and I had been here for 3 or 4 years when I was doing some sessions for an engineer here in Austin, and she was her name was Gina Fant, and she was developing remote session software, and she wanted people to be trying it out. So she offered to show me the basics of Pro Tools so that I could be one of her beta testers, which was an incredibly generous offer. I didn't know anything about Pro Tools, but the M-Box had just come out. So she taught me that, and then shortly after that, I had a guitar student, who was involved in advertising on the creative end. He was part of a creative team. So he got me involved in working on music for a Krispy Kreme jingle, a radio spot. And through that, I became involved with a music. There was one big music house here in Austin at the time called Tequila Mockingbird.
Okay.
And ironically, that's actually the building that I have my studio in now.
Oh, wow, that's
I'm sitting. The booth that I showed you before we got on with this interview is the booth where I sang on the jingle that was my very first commercial gig. I got to do background vocals on my own spot.
Wow.
On my own track. So Brian looped me in on this demo process where a bunch of people were writing demos for this Krispy Kreme thing, and I had one of the winning jingles. So that was my first. That was the second or third thing I'd worked on, and it was the first thing that I won, which was tremendous. I thought, oh well, I guess I can do that. You know?
Right. Right.
And my MO throughout my entire music career has always been, if they let me do it once, surely I can do it again.
Right.
So I came in the next week to talk to one of the two partners of the music house, and I was like, that was fun. How do I do more of that? And they're like, well, there's a long line, but maybe you want to go, there's some music houses in Dallas you could try, maybe they need somebody. So, now this is coming from New York City where like nobody has time to do anything. And if you don't get to the point, like, forget it. But in Texas, if you don't sit and chat for half an hour, then you're a rude Yankee who doesn't have time for the simple pleasures of life. You're like getting to the point is too, what's your problem? Like, we're here to chat. Like, why do you have to it's rude almost to bring up the work part too soon.
Right.
So I had this long chat here at Tequila Mockingbird, and then I called up these music houses in Dallas, and to my astonishment, they were like, yeah, sure, you can talk to so-and-so. Like, when do you want to come in? I was like, really? So I went, and I was going up to Fort Worth to play a gig with a band I was in at the time. And
so these were, David, cold calls then? Yeah,
they were. Yeah, which, my hands were shaking. I was standing by the phone. My wife was like, just call him. And I was like, and yeah, I called up and I got some receptionist person, and I said, I need to talk, is John, can I make an appointment to come in and see John? And they were like, yeah, when's good?
Right. Wow.
I was shocked. And the same thing, I went in and I met both these guys, these two different music houses, and both cases, they were like, yeah, come on in. We sat in their studio. I talked to them for half an hour. One of the guys, I found out, like, we both had young kids. We had the same birthday. We liked this kind of band. I was like, it was nothing I'd ever experienced as far as trying to get to know people work-wise, where I felt like they had something I really wanted to get next to.
Yeah. Wow, that's very, very cool. And then you ended up working. So where did it go from there? So you ended up doing work for these guys.
Weirdly, yes. So I left a reel with both of them, and it was the most pretend reel. It had my Krispy Kreme spot basically, and then it had 9 other things. They were just pieces of music I'd written in my studio, and my studio at the time was our garage, which we had built out with like walls and ventilation, and my studio was a laptop, an M-Box, a pod, an AT4033 microphone, and a $60 set of computer speakers with a subwoofer.
Wow.
That was my studio, and I had a couple soft. I think I had Stylus and Atmosphere, maybe Trillion. Like, I had like the Spectrasonic stuff, and that was it. That's all I had. And I had made these tracks with that, and some instruments that I knew how to play. So that was my reel. It was one real track and 9 fake ones.
Right.
But those two guys listened to my stuff, and one of them called me about a month later and said, yeah, this track, is it available? Because from my reel, this piece I had written. And he ended up putting it on a Comcast spot, which, that never happens. And then the other guy at the other music house, they ended up making a deal with FirstCom, the library company, to make, I think, like a dozen libraries that year. And so he called and subcontracted one of them to me. He wanted a bunch of just solo acoustic or duet or trio acoustic guitar pieces. Because he'd listened to my reel and it was like, I see where you're coming from. You're kind of this guy. And I was like, no, I can do everything, like every new composer is.
Right.
But he called me for the thing that was obvious that I was the best at, which was playing the guitar. And it took me like 10 years to come full circle on that and realize, like, no, it's good to be a specialist at something. It's good to be the guy they call for this, because they won't call you for everything. They have someone who's great at orchestration. They have someone who's great at writing, like, I don't know, like Henry Mancini, James Bond, whatever. Not that Mancini did James Bond, but like they have someone who's really great at period stuff. They have someone who's really great at hip hop. They have someone who's great, like super contemporary synth, whatever.
Yeah.
If you're the guy who's great at, playing acoustic instruments, then, not every spot calls for, those things. But when they have anything that's remotely in that wheelhouse, I get called for banjo, I get called for pedal steel, I get called for nylon string. Like, I'm not the best at any of those things, but they have in their head, like, if it's rootsy,
you're the guy.
Not, like one or, a couple of people have that thing that they